ways around this. Now, because in a free market, individuals are involved in mutually beneficial exchange, so both parties are being made better off when they're in these exchanges. If the government bans it for some reason, whether because the good or service is bad and has negative consequences, or whether it's because, I don't know, maybe there's a particular regulation, maybe there's public outcry that people don't like it, for whatever reason, if both parties can make themselves better off by engaging in the trade, they're likely to try to do it. Only they'll do it without the formal protection of the market. So black market is where we see buyers and sellers trade outside the protection of law. Earlier in the class, I said that, that the government, one of the most important roles for them in the market is to ensure that transactions are taking place and both parties to those transactions are basically held to whatever they agree to do. So if a firm offers a defective product, they know it's defective, the government provides a legal system where the consumer that gets harmed can, to use a legal term, be made whole. So they can be compensated for the problems that were caused. Likewise, if you take out a loan and you don't pay it back, you don't uphold your end of that agreement, whoever you borrow money from can take you to court, force you to pay that back. In the black market, we don't have any of this. So you can have either party offer substandard goods, you could have them agree to pay something in the future and then not pay it, and you can't go to the government to arbitrate these disputes. Now, when the government enacts price controls, like we talked about last class, people can still find a way around it if they want those goods or services. Even the Soviet Union, where every price was controlled by the government, where they set the prices and how much to produce, if people wanted goods, they could find ways around it, find other ways to get those goods. So for instance, maybe they're friends with someone who owns the butcher shop in town. They have them set aside some meat, and they offer them with something from their line of work that they take offline, they give to that person. So they're in essence paying a higher price because they're bribing them or like giving them special favors. But the actual price being paid, as far as the government is aware, is whatever they set it at. So for when markets where there's rent control, you can have tenants offering to pay high prices under the table. They can do things to try to sweeten the deal for the landlord to get them into that apartment. If there's 5 people looking to rent one apartment and they're all offering the same amount, the landlord has a decision to make. Makes it a lot easier for them if you go and offer them an extra $100 a month under the table. One solution is short-term rentals. So some landlords do that. They switch to like Airbnb because they can get higher rates on there because they're not covered under rent control. Technically, this is like operating in the black market, but governments tend not to like enforce it, tend not to clamp down on it. Uber originally, there was a big cities had taxi medallions where there's only so many available slots to be a professional taxi driver. Outside of that, you're operating like illegally. Uber came in and just totally ignored that, let anyone sign up for them, and basically dared cities to stop them. But they were so cheap and so efficient, so much better, that they became too popular before cities could crack down on them. So now we're going to look at the market for drugs. And Ricky Bobby, wow, you really can't see that. When he's talking in Talladega Nights about what he wants to do post-driving, he says, maybe be a drug dealer, sell some crack, but be like a nice drug dealer. So we're going to talk about the market for drugs. And we'll look at the market for illegal drugs like it's a regular market, because we can study it in many of the same ways. We'll see a lot of the same things we see in typical markets, except we're not going to see legal protection from the government. So they're not going to be able to arbitrate disputes, which is the main problem with black markets. So black markets can result for a lot of different reasons. It could be evading price controls. It could be the evasion of taxes. Maybe there's very high taxes on the product that's for sale. Some cities have extremely high taxes on cigarettes, so you have people selling illegal cigarettes without those taxes. They're selling them under the table at just the market price. And sometimes there's legal prohibition. So the government says you cannot buy these illegal drugs. So black market forms, and people still want to buy and sell those illegal drugs. Well, we end up, the result of black markets, because we don't have the government serving as the independent arbitrator, they don't settle disputes between parties involved. We end up with more defective products. Again, because there's no government to punish you, there's no civil court to go to. There's no regulations that apply because it's illegal. We end up with a greater number of defective products. And if you're a consumer in a black market and you get a defective product, there's no one you can go to. There tends to be higher profits in black markets. And again, because there's no government involved, there's violence to settle disputes. So if two companies in a regular market engage in competition, if one does something, maybe they steal the other's intellectual property, those two firms can go to the court system and they can settle the dispute. They can say, hey, like, they stole my intellectual property. There'll be, court hearings, they'll provide some evidence, both sides will provide some evidence, make some arguments, and then the judge will make a decision. In a black market, again, they can't go through this arbitration process, usually just ends up with violence between those two organizations. In markets, we typically think of government as the final arbitrator, and this is true. At the end of the day, they're the one with the most power when two parties in the market have a dispute. But there's other groups as well. There's like the Better Business Bureau or like Good Housekeeping, like seal of approval, where you can go to private entities to get rated as like high quality. And if there's issues, people often go to the Better Business Bureau. Like Michael Scott said, what was it? On the Watermark episode of The Office, the woman said she's going to the Better Business Bureau to complain, have their like rating lowered, and he says, I'm calling the Ungrateful Biatch hotline. You have these third parties, the independent, not government, that you can still go to hold people accountable or hold firms accountable for low quality goods. There's also like trade associations, professional associations for like, well, I guess trade associations more for like contractors, and then professional associations for professions that are licensed. We'll go through the most extreme example and one that's going on today, so it's more practical than looking at, a black market that existed 100 years ago, like during alcohol prohibition. We'll look at the market for drugs. So there's a lot of problems associated with drug use. So one of the goals of drug prohibition is to reduce drug use because it's harmful to the user. Physically, like it has some, long-term drug use has effects on the body. People who want to reduce drug use, drug warriors, don't like how much money is being spent on drugs. They think people had better uses for that money. And then there's often crime resulting from drug use. Now, drug prohibition, so by banning drugs, we can affect people's demand for drugs. You guys have any guesses how it'll affect people's demand for drugs? You think demand will go up? Why would demand go up?
If you can't get it, more people want to really break I
don't know, I think there's something there.
I think since it's like illegal now, it would go down a little bit.
And why would it go down?
So people are really not getting in trouble.
So there's an additional cost to doing drugs, not just the price you're paying, but the potential for being arrested.
go up because supply goes down?
Well, remember, a shift in the supply curve won't cause a shift in the demand curve. It'll cause like a movement along the demand curve, unless there's some other change in one of the determinants of demand. Which again, like you can have two things, supply and demand shifting at the same time. I think maybe for some people it would go up because it's dangerous or it's edgy, it's illegal. So while it might not make the market for drugs go up, individuals within that market may want to consume more, may be more likely to do it. Yeah, so another thing is societal norms against drugs. By creating the societal norm, creating something where people are like, oh yeah, drugs are a bad thing because they're legal, you end up with fewer people wanting to do drugs. When you have, sort of stigma against something in society, you end up with fewer people wanting to do it because people don't want to go against the grain. Most people. Some people love going against the grain. Like you mentioned, punishment and penalties, you're increasing the cost of consuming drugs. As you increase the cost of using drugs, fewer people in general are going to do it. And there's the idea, and this is what people who pass these anti-drug laws hope, is that respect for the law is going to discourage drug use. There's also effects on the supply side of the market. So there's no legal enforcement of contracts, which may reduce the supply of drugs available. Because you don't have this robust market, you don't have different companies willing to work together, sign these long-term contracts for whether it's distribution or getting raw materials. You don't have these long-term relationships developing. You don't have wholesalers that you can trust and can advertise. So it makes it more difficult for these markets to operate. So we end up with fewer firms in this market. Another cost that would tend to reduce supply is that you have to evade law enforcement. Because these drugs are illegal, you can't just ship them in an 18-wheeler and drive them somewhere. You need to hide these drugs. Like every 80s movie that involved like law enforcement, like I'm thinking Beverly Hills Cop was the one, like the main example. They had like the giant crates full of cocaine and they had a little bit of coffee on top to throw the dogs off the scent. You've got to figure out some way to hide it, and it ends up being a lot more expensive to do. Speaking of trying to ship cocaine, do you guys know how Mitch McConnell got the nickname Cocaine Mitch? Have you guys heard him being called Cocaine Mitch? Mitch McConnell, like he's in the Senate. He's a Republican leader in the Senate, and he looks like a turtle, kind of a weird old dude. Well, this guy running for Senate in West Virginia in the Republican primary ran an attack ad against Mitch McConnell and called him Cocaine Mitch out of nowhere. It's a conspiracy theory that develops because a company that his wife's family is a major shareholder in, one of their vessels got caught with trying to smuggle some cocaine into the United States. So obviously, according to this guy, Mitch McConnell's involved. But because McConnell is so weird and turtle-like, a lot of people just started using Cocaine Mitch as like a nickname to make fun of him. I guess I follow some weird people on Twitter compared to like what you guys are interested in. Another thing that would tend to reduce supply is that bribes are costly. So if you're trying to get past law enforcement, customs agents, whoever, you're going to end up dealing with a decent amount of bribes. And finally, it's going to be more expensive to operate in the market for drugs, so you have to compensate employees for this added risk. There's more violence associated in the market for drugs than in other legal markets. The odds of getting arrested and the need for people to maintain their silence when they're being interrogated by the cops necessitates you paying them more money to compensate them for this cost. So the US drug policy tends to be supply side focused. Rather than trying to reduce demand, they're focusing on going after drug organizations, drug traffickers, trying to reduce the amount of drugs in the United States. Some other countries, I think Portugal's the most famous one, tries to decriminalize drugs and treat it as like a mental health issue, give people like the resources to basically reduce their demand for drugs. The United States does the opposite. They try to make it more difficult to be in the business of drugs.
Not saying it would work here, but isn't it working pretty well in Portugal for that? Like, how's it-
Everything I've read has been like positive about what Portugal's done. I can't speak to how true those perceptions are because I haven't read anything like really in depth. It's been more like op-ed kind of stuff. So people might be a little biased. As far as I know, it's been working pretty well.
Isn't Portland trying to pretty much do the same thing?
Yeah, they decriminalize a bunch of stuff. And the basic idea is instead of throwing people in jail for a long time, give them some sort of like drug counseling and see if that will reduce their demand for drugs in the future, help them get over it. Because often drugs aren't just like fun for people to do, they also have that like physical addiction aspect as well. I really like that like a city's doing that so we can see how well it actually works without having the whole country do it at once, just in case it doesn't work. One of the best parts of the federalism in the United States is you can have different states or localities enact different laws or different policies and try it out. We also see harsh sentences for drug dealers. So back in the 90s, they passed like a 3 strikes law where if you got convicted 3 times, you ended up going to jail for life. So very, very strict sentences in order to increase the cost of engaging in this market. The hope is that by decreasing the supply of drugs out there, there's just fewer drugs being sold like on the street. This will drive up the price. So we'll move along the demand curve to a spot where there's just fewer and fewer being bought and sold because the price is now so much higher.
Can you just put a price ceiling too? Or a price floor, I guess?
So legalize it and put a super high price floor on it.
Yeah. Like a really strict, like quality standards, and then, like a super high price floor.
I would say this for the end, but we might as well talk about it now. So basically, we're getting rid of the quality problem. One of the biggest problems with like heroin is that it's different strengths, and they don't know about it ahead of time, so they inject it, and sometimes they overdose because it's stronger than they expected. So if you standardize it, you're not gonna have ODs. You solve all the other problems with heroin. Fewer ODs, and because it's now a legal market, there's less violence associated with it. But you're putting a price floor on it, so now it's a really high price. So the demand side doesn't really change. So that's one potential solution. Gets rid of some of the negatives we see in this black market. So does this happen in practice? What do we see happening in this market for drugs? Do we substantially reduce demand because of the war on drug policies we have trying to affect the supply side? Or does it not have that much of an effect? To do this, we'll look at the market for crystal meth. And we'll break this down like it's a real market. So for crystal meth, do you guys think it has elastic demand or inelastic demand? Do you think people are sensitive to the price changes of crystal meth?
Inelastic.
You think inelastic?
Yeah, it's not gonna move.
It's not going to move very much. Anyone else agree or disagree?
Generally, meth users are pretty broke, so I think if the price like shot up, they'd find nothing to do.
Because they're broke, it's a large portion of their income.
Yeah, like, they're like physically can't afford it at a certain point of rate. Yeah.
So the market tends to be inelastic, but that's what's keeping it from being even more elastic. So instead of being like, or that's what prevents it from being like perfectly inelastic, because it can be such a huge proportion of their income, it ends up making it more elastic than otherwise. Then like insulin that we see like perfectly inelastic. So both of those things are going on simultaneously.
Does this take into account like non-monetary prices associated with it as the price increases?
What do you mean by
And
that?
you'll see people turning to like using other things rather than money to get what they want when the price gets too high. Like they'll start working for the drug dealer, or they'll do illegal things for their drug dealer, so because they don't have any money to give them, so they'll essentially provide services at that point.
That's a side effect of this market we'll talk about later, but I'm not including that in this price that I have on this supply and demand. This is just monetary price, because there's a lot of other things that's like associated with it that would be like a cost to someone that's hard to put dollars and cents on. So let's say our supply side policy is working. We're reducing the amount of crystal meth in circulation. So we're shifting our supply curve from S1 to S2. Because the market or the demand is pretty inelastic, we end up moving from this equilibrium price, where these two cross, to this new equilibrium price up here. So we see this large increase in the price for drugs, for crystal meth. But because the demand is inelastic, the quantity demanded in equilibrium moves from here to right there. So we're not moving very far at all. So what we end up seeing is, even if we have these large reductions in the supply of crystal meth, what we end up doing is increasing the price, but not really the quantity that's being bought and sold in the market. Again, because the determining factors for using crystal meth is the utility, so the high that people get from it, and the lack of substitutes because of the physical dependency. Price isn't really going to be a factor in this case, as long as you have physically enough money to pay for it. So if we have drug policy focusing on the supply side, it ends up having a small effect on the overall usage of drugs. Now, that's not to say that like pretty much the same number of people are going to be in this market. Because we have this increase in the cost of being involved in the market for crystal meth, we may have far fewer users. But we may have the users that stay in the market using more than they would otherwise. So you have fewer people willing to try for the first time, less willing to get involved in this market as a consumer for the first time. For habitual users, people that have used crystal meth for a long time, they're going to have increased costs, but their demand is still going to remain relatively the same, the quantity they're actually demanding in this market. And this implies that we'll see, like you mentioned, more crime for people that love to use crystal meth and can't afford the drugs. Again, because there's this lack of substitutes for crystal meth, you'll see them be willing to engage in crime in order to have enough money, I don't know, sell things they own that they shouldn't be selling. And this is one of the main reasons why people that are opposed to drug use want to keep drugs illegal. What we're going to see for the drug dealers is a reduction in the quantity that's being sold, not by a lot, but by some amount, but they're getting greater revenue for each sale. Again, because the price increases so much as the supply falls, that they're making a higher profit per unit that's being sold. So the dealers who are able to evade law enforcement, that are able to keep selling in this market, are made better off than if the market was in equilibrium with, where it's not banned, so you have the government protections, things like that. Now, there are some unintended consequences associated with the prohibition on drugs. The first is that we have this unintentional promotion of crime. So while this market still continues, they're going to use violence to settle disputes because there's no independent arbitrator. Or very rarely are there independent arbitrators. You watch like The Godfather, like the families get together, and they settle disputes they have. In the first one, Don Corleone goes there, and like his one son was already killed. Michael's hiding over in in Sicily, and they negotiate some sort of a truce so Michael can come back and not be assassinated. But typically, in the market for drugs today, we don't see some arbiter overseeing different disputes. So these tend to become violent. Rivals engage in turf battles. You can't like increase your advertising. You can't like improve your product to get more favorable reviews from consumers to increase your demand. What you have to do is actually take over territory that one of your competitors is controlling. So that lends itself towards violence. Another problem that causes crime or increases the amount of crime in this is that black markets attract what's called high time preference individuals. High time preference means they put a low rate on like saving for the future. They have much more of a desire to consume now. So $1 today is worth more to them than $1 in the future. Whereas like a low time preference individual is someone who saves, a huge part of their paycheck every month, every couple weeks for their retirement. High time preference individuals focus much more on now, the benefits they can get now rather than benefits in the future. So people are willing to engage in this risky behavior now because of their preference for utility right now versus the future. So you have people less concerned about the future. They're more willing to do risky things or to like engage in violence where there's a threat of being arrested. There's also a negative effect for users. You have this decrease in quality. So there's no quality control or very limited quality control. Because there's no one to go to if you get low quality crystal meth. You can't call the police. Like, you always hear the jokes about like the people that call the cops on someone for like their friend or their significant other for stealing their drugs. Cops show up and arrest both of them. That's like the classic like dumb criminals thing. Obviously, you can't do that because you'll get in trouble yourself. So you can't say, hey, I got bad crystal meth from this person. I want to sue them, get some money back for it. So we tend to see much lower quality products in black markets. And when there's prohibition, it increases the potency per unit. So the drugs you get are going to be stronger and stronger than you would in a free market. That's protected by the government, where you have, whether you have regulation or not, it will be higher potency. Basically, because higher potency is easier to conceal. So when you're trying to hide it from the police, if you can make it more potent, so you have a smaller physical package to conceal, makes it that much easier. You also see risky consumption methods to maximize the return on investment, so to speak, of using these drugs. And finally, the fixed cost of avoiding authorities. You're going to have to spend a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of effort to avoid authorities. That incentivizes this shift to more potent drugs. This is basically the Alchian-Allen effect we talked about before. No matter whether your drugs are high quality or low quality, high potency or low potency, no matter what, you have to spend a lot of money to avoid law enforcement. And it's not going to change based off of like the price of your drugs. So what we'll see is these organizations using more high potency drugs. Again, because they're facing the same cost, there's a lower opportunity cost for these higher potency drugs. This is just one example. It's from like a year ago of a guy trying to sneak into a stadium. This is over in Turkey, going to a soccer match. It was like 70 degrees over there, but he was wearing a winter jacket, so they stopped him and asked him what he was doing, and they pulled out 3 cases of beer from his winter jacket. 3 cases worth of beer, hidden in all the different pockets and stuff. If you're trying to sneak alcohol into an event, how are you going to do it? Are you going to bring 3 cases of beer? Or are you going to bring 2 flasks? Are you going to put a 5th in a cut-out loaf of bread? you're going to switch to a more potent form of alcohol when you're not allowed to bring it into a stadium to make it easier to conceal. So we see the same thing going on. It's not just with drugs. We'd see this with any other product that's prohibited from being bought and sold. You have to respect this guy for smuggling in that many beers. So let's use the economic way of thinking to think about what's going on with drug prohibition. And we can apply this to any other good that's banned. The first is it's not the nature of the product that causes problems in society. Most of the violence here is due to the black market itself. It's the lack of protection. It doesn't allow competition or nonviolent competition to take place. It's not the actual drugs themselves. There's a lot of violence in the market for crack cocaine back in like the 80s and 90s. The reason why we saw much more violence for this drug than for other drugs was because you didn't need the same hierarchical organization to like ship, to prepare, and distribute that you needed for other drugs. So you had more people willing to engage in these turf battles to try to expand their territory. Had nothing to do with the form of the drug. So there's much higher sentences even today for powder cocaine versus crack cocaine. What caused the difference is the type of organization of like the drug organizations. Their management structure, how many people they needed, and their, I guess you could say, management style. It wasn't the actual drug itself. Now there are very different other types of illegal products that had extremely similar problems to what we see with the market for drugs today. So prostitution, which is illegal in most of the United States. Anyone know where it is legal?
Vegas, Reno.
Not in Vegas or Reno, but you're very close.
Carson City.
The rest of Nevada. Any county in Nevada with less than 400,000 residents. I guess in Vegas they just, turn a blind eye to it. Anywhere else? Not anymore, but in Connecticut, a judge threw out their anti-prostitution law because of something else associated with it. So they legalized indoor prostitution. So not like street prostitution, but indoor prostitution for, I think, 5 or 6 years before passing a new law banning it again. I've been doing some work on massage therapist licensing because massage therapy is associated with prostitution. So we've had to like use this in our research. So unfortunately, I know a lot about the prostitution laws in the US. And I seem like a really big fucking creep. Other markets that had similar problems, gambling. A lot of types of gambling. High stake poker games are like illegal outside of casinos in a lot of places. You have these high stake poker games being played underground, or I guess like cockfighting. We were talking about the episode of Seinfeld where Kramer gets involved in cockfighting by accident. I hadn't seen that one before. Alcohol and prohibition in the 1920s, we saw the same exact problems we saw with the market for drugs. Today, Coors doesn't go shoot up whoever makes Lucky Streak. But back in the 1920s, we saw violence all over with alcohol. Is anyone not from the US in this class? Okay, we were talking about prohibition once when I was at like a undergrad conference thing, and this girl from Russia was like, "What the hell are you talking about?" She had never heard of prohibition, and then she couldn't believe that a country ever banned alcohol. Because those Russians are crazy when it comes to alcohol. They didn't consider beer, they considered it a soft drink, not actual alcohol, until like 5 years ago. So in the Sochi Olympics, when Americans drank out like all the beer in these bars in Russia, everyone's like, "Yeah, USA, like no one outdrinks us." But the reason why we like drank them out of that beer was because they didn't consider it alcohol. So they didn't think people want to go in and drink it. So that was the Winter Olympics where we beat Russia in hockey. So that was a big thing. we're very hardcore about those Olympics. Now, legal stimulants with similar characteristics to illegal drugs are not plagued by violence. So a lot of ADD drugs are very similar to meth. We don't see, I don't know, Pfizer shooting up Bayer or like some other producer of these drugs. We don't see, I don't know, we have the government able to oversee these disputes, so we don't see these sort of problems. We have quality control. We have people able to sue if these products are low quality. So we don't see the type of violence and all the other problems associated with black markets for very similar but legal stimulants. And a joke about the war on drugs, but how devastating it's been, how many people have gone to jail for nonviolent offenses, and how many cases property or crimes went up. But you know, and drug use still continues. That's not really in the textbook, but they talk about black markets and prohibition a little bit. So I wanted to go more in depth and, I don't know, give an in-depth example of it. Do you guys have any questions about that? Because it's not in the book. Anything to clear up?
Economically speaking, wouldn't the government subsidizing drugs be a better option?
So getting more drugs on the street.
No, so like if they say like kind of the same thing they do with pharmaceuticals. Right? They're heavily controlled, but you can only get them through a doctor. So like if they were controlled and you could get them like prescribed, so the price was, you know, everything was controlled. The quality was controlled, the price was controlled, the distribution was controlled, but it was decriminalized. So you took away the cost of like the cost of doing it illegally. But
Who gets the prescriptions?
well, you'd have to prescribe it to anybody who was addicted. You'd have to treat it as a mental illness. So it would be harder.
Well, you would still have the black market for people that wanted to use them recreationally, that didn't have a prescription.
Yeah, that would
getting
be,
it.
like that would be, you would have to find a way to deal with that. But for like current addicts, wouldn't it, you know, like if you could get it more cheaply through like a government subsidized form, but the amount and the strength was controlled, wouldn't that be a better option than, you know, your local dealer where you don't know what you're getting? Because you're taking
I mean, this is more my personal opinion, but I think that at least be better. There's still difficulties associated with it, but anything that controls the quality makes it like more standardized. Better.
thinking like economically speaking, you're taking away all the costs of like the risk of getting arrested, the risk of an abuse, and you're taking away all those risks, but you're adding the cost of you have to work like with a doctor to get a prescription, and you can only get so much. But I feel like for a lot of people that at least aren't, you know, like a lot of people that are like, oh, I'd rather just do that rather than maybe get a deal for the next 20 years or whatever.
Yeah, for already like not occasional, but like frequent users, that probably be a better system. But there's still, like I said, gonna be a lot of problems associated with them, like you said. Like, one guy who talks about like drugs, he says some of them, like heroin, you know, are so dangerous that they need to be legalized, which is an interesting way to think about it. I don't know if I agree with it, but just because of all the problems with inconsistencies and the lack of standardization of the quality, you don't know how strong it's going to be from time to time, so you're just kind of guessing. It would at least reduce a lot of the risk associated with it, like risk of like health, death, and stuff like that.
Do you think you could almost like legalize a way to prescribe recreational drugs? Like, which sounds really weird. But
Basically, hey doc, I'm going to a rave this weekend.
yeah.
Can I get some Molly?
And that way the doctor could be like, all right, here's enough that it's gonna like mess you up for the weekend, but not enough that you're gonna die or be addicted for the rest of your life. Because then the doctor could figure out, you know, like more closely what it's gonna do to you, rather than, you know, being at a rave and just being like, all right, well, let's give this one a go and see what happens. I don't know. It's a weird idea, but
My gut reaction is there's going to be a lot of problems associated with that. But again, it reduces that risk associated with consumption and with the different qualities. I think it is interesting. Is there anything else about the market for drugs? Okay, so getting back to price controls in general. When the government imposed price controls, we get three basic things going. The first is that some people win. They're made better off. So those that get the protection are being made better off. So tenants in rent-controlled apartments are being made better off. Those that are able to work, getting this new higher minimum wage, they're made better off. The farmers, when there's these price floors in agriculture, being made better off. They're the ones, when we draw the supply and demand of price controls, they're the ones capturing some of the economic surplus. That was the other parties originally. One half of that market is going to be made better off by these price controls. But some people are also made worse off. So losers are the renters or potential renters that are unable to get apartments when there's rent control. It's people that are buying agricultural products that are now paying higher prices for it. And people that don't end up buying these agricultural products because of the higher price, so the transactions that don't take place. There's the third one. People that are priced out of working because of the minimum wage, and the firms that are unable to hire people because of the minimum wage. So we get some winners and some losers. We also get a loss of economic efficiency. Remember, there's that deadweight loss that takes place from those transactions that don't occur. So in essence, we have a smaller pie to split up. Okay, so going back to Richard Nixon, claiming he's not a crook, he enacted a lot of price controls in the 1970s because of runaway inflation. It's something maybe your parents or probably your grandparents remember. It was one of the biggest failures from the economics profession for a long time. So we continue to use it as an example time and time again of things that can go wrong. Because we had this really high inflation, Nixon instituted a bunch of price controls, trying to prevent the prices of these products from increasing, make it better for consumers, and help his re-election chances, because he would do anything it took to get re-elected. He had C. Jackson Grayson serve as the chairman of the Price Commission, and this commission's job was to set prices, was to determine what price ceilings they could have. Now, C. Jackson Grayson wrote a whole book later detailing what was all the problems, basically, that he found trying to set prices and trying to be a central planner. And the irony that, we're 1970s, we're not the height of the Cold War, kind of in the lull, so we're after like the Bay of Pigs crisis and like the concern about getting nuked, kids hiding under their desks, because obviously that protects you from nuclear fallout. And then the 1980s when we're, Rocky's fighting Ivan Drago and we're going against the end of the evil empire. But still, we're in pretty intense competition with the Soviet Union. One of the main reasons being that communism has price controls, government control of the entire economy. Yet Nixon is instituting many of these same things in the United States in an effort to maintain his office of the presidency. So C. Jackson Grayson gave 6 main lessons that he took away from this, of trying to institute price controls. So I wanted to include this here to show you guys just some of the problems associated with trying to set these prices. The first is that by enacting price controls, you're masking real changes to economic fundamentals. There's real things going on, like prices don't just change for no reason. In the situation, there's something going on there. So price controls In the 1970s, these are implemented to fight inflation. This runaway inflation that by the end of the decade is up to over 10%, 11% a year. It assumes that all price changes are due to inflationary pressures, and it's just due to like an increase in the money supply or something. But that's not the case. And even in the 1970s, where there was a lot of inflationary pressure from changes in the money supply, there were also a lot of changes in supply and demand that were going on that were causing prices to increase. Remember with OPEC's oil embargo? That causes the price of just about everything to increase. That's what's called a supply shock. So we have the supply curve shifting to the left or decreasing. Well, this is our market in equilibrium at the time. Then we have a reduction in the amount of oil that OPEC is selling. So we're shifting the supply curve to the left. Ending up with fewer goods being sold, and they're being sold at a higher price. What the price controls try to do is just ignore this reality. Ignore that we had the supply curve shifting to the left and try to keep it down at these prices. But as the prices of goods and services keep increasing, the prices of inputs, because crude oil is used in shipping just about every good. It's also used in plastic, which is at least the packaging of a lot of goods and still used in a lot of goods themselves. So costs are increasing. So if you try to keep it at that equilibrium price, we end up, you force it to here, a much lower quantity being bought and sold on the market. Because it's more expensive, if you cap the price right here, firms aren't able to produce more. So the desire to make it easier for consumers to purchase these goods and services actually makes it more difficult because we now have so many fewer on the market. And when you can't use price to ration goods, you end up with those long gas lines that we saw. I showed that clip of the previous class. You end up having to wait for it and hope you're the first one there to get it. And it's important to remember that prices communicate information. So capping the price right here prevents that from occurring. We're not transmitting the information that now costs have gone up. So maybe entrepreneurs need to figure out a new way to reduce the usage of oil and its byproducts in their goods and services. We're moving that signal so we don't have people doing that. We don't have them recognizing that this is a thing. Next, you end up ignoring the role of profit. So we're assuming, if we're enacting these price controls like Richard Nixon, that profit is a result of taking advantage of consumers. We know from earlier that profit encourages the production of certain goods and services that meet consumer needs. Whoever makes White Claw gets a really good profit because the demand suddenly soars. Encourages more firms to offer these types of hard seltzers. It's a signal and an incentive. So profit is a very important role in economic decision making. Also, by capping the prices here, you're reducing firms' ability to profit, especially because their costs are increasing in this situation. So you're discouraging long-run investment. So firms have less money on hand to be willing to borrow to expand their facilities or to add new machinery that's more efficient, that requires less energy, so they can lower their prices in the long run. So you see less and less productivity improvement. And if you look at a graph of productivity in the United States over the 20th century, you see a big dip in the 1970s. This was only partially to blame, but it was still a contributing factor. Next is that you replace economic competition with political competition. So it's changing how resources are being allocated. So resources are still scarce. There's only so much to go around. So we have to decide, how are we going to use it? What goods or services are we going to use these resources in the production of? Because we're not using price to do that anymore, we're not allowing the market, so supply and demand, to set prices. what you end up with, and in many cases, is industries lobbying government, trying to get prices capped in their industry or for resources that they need. Or trying to prevent the price of their goods and services from being capped. So rather than firms competing amongst each other, you have them competing for basically government favors. It also normalizes the attitude of reliance on government, not consumers. So firms are focused on what the government's doing, focused on, what Congress is going to decide for the next round of price controls, rather than focusing on what consumer needs. Remember, one of the best things about the market is that you have firms that need to meet consumer needs. They're rewarded for meeting consumer needs, and they're punished when they don't meet consumer needs. If you take the focus away from that, their attitude changes and focuses more on what the government is doing, trying to influence what government does, how they're going to change prices in this situation. You don't get these good things from the market. You don't get this good results of meeting consumer needs. You end up making consumers worse off. So this is one of those times where the market actually breaks down. It gives you suboptimal outcomes because they're not focusing on consumers. In the next chapter, we're going to explore some more instances where we see markets fail to achieve these optimal outcomes, but changing their focus from consumers to other parties is a huge, it results in huge shortcomings. The next problem is price controls can generate regime uncertainty. What regime uncertainty means is that firms or consumers have trouble anticipating what the laws and rules are going to be. If they suspect regulations or, they're changing regulations, say, every year, they're changing what the price can be sold, or what price that goods can be sold at, like every month or every couple months, it's very difficult to plan for the long term. It's hard enough in the market to plan for the long term because you don't know what changes are going to happen. But it's even more difficult when you add in potentially changing regulations. So government dysfunction and political infighting in Congress, these sorts of things can really negatively impact businesses and their ability to plan for the future. In my plan for the future, that's not just like, well, how much are we going to make this year? How much next year? How much the following year? What price are we going to sell it at next year? It's investing in long-term projects. It's borrowing so they can expand their operation or get new, more efficient or more energy efficient machines to help the production process. You take long-term planning, and when you have this problem with regime uncertainty, when you don't know when these things are going to change, it makes it much more difficult to plan for the future. And finally, price controls mask the true economic problems. Very similar to the first one. So it's framed as a response to market failure. If we see these increase in prices going on, we see these profits increasing. So we need price controls to stop that. But there's other things going on than just speculation or greed. There's a lot of underlying causes to these price increases, especially if you're looking back at like the 1970s, what was going on back then. So there's things with monetary policy going on, like you learned about the Fed, Econ 101. They may be doing the right thing or the wrong thing. In case of the 1970s, they allowed too much inflation. So that was some of the problem. Some of it could be tariffs. Whether you think tariffs are good or bad for the economy, they necessarily increase the prices of goods and services from abroad. So that's going to, cause higher prices. Regulation, again, whether it's worth it or not worth it for regulations to, improve the quality of goods and services or to improve working conditions or, the environment, again, we're still adding costs to the production process. So it's going to increase the prices of these goods and services. Taxes, which we talk about next section, you increase taxes, you're going to increase the price of goods and services. And then there's changes in relative scarcity. Things going on in the market where we now need this resource for the production of other products versus this product. Because the demand for these natural resources are increasing, the price of goods that use them are now going to increase. All these different things are going on, And it can be difficult, especially in real time, to tease out which is happening. It takes some time to recognize this. But if we enact price controls, we can't even tell. We have no idea what's going on with these. So we don't know why the price of goods or services have this pressured increase, because the price doesn't change. All we see is the quantity that's being bought and sold in the market falling over time. So price controls end up misleading citizens regarding the fundamental, causes of the perceived price increases. So it implies, or they outright state, that it's more caused by increasing, or firms being greedy, trying to increase profit, speculators driving up the prices of goods, instead of underlying fundamental problems, whether we're increasing the cost of doing businesses or cost of business through like tariffs, taxes, regulations, things like that, or whether we have this changes in the relative scarcity, changes in all these different markets that are causing prices to change. So what we end up doing is focusing on the symptoms rather than the cause of what's going on. In the 1970s, a big part of it was because of this decrease in the supply of oil. Price controls mask that. So we didn't encourage firms to try to find more productive ways that use less oil to reduce their costs. All right, we have just a couple minutes left, so we'll end with price gouging laws. Price gouging laws are put in place so the prices don't rise during a crisis. It's been a while. I think 34 states have some sort of price gouging laws, where they say if there's a natural disaster, you can't increase prices by like 200% in a week. Something like that. They say above this certain price increase, price increase is immoral. You're just taking advantage of people in a bad situation. But during a crisis, supply and demand are changing. So when a hurricane hits Florida, more people suddenly want generators. They suddenly want plywood to board their homes. Things like that. There's much higher demand in this time because they need to protect their homes in a way they normally, don't need to protect their homes. So not allowing the prices to change, locking in these prices, masks this underlying reality, that there's a much greater demand. So we have a market for generators here. In normal times, we have this price and this quantity. Say the hurricane is about to hit. Suddenly the demand sharply increases. People now want to buy and sell a lot more generators. They want to buy a lot more generators. But the price of generators has substantially increased. Again, we haven't had anything to change the supply of generators. Now, if we're looking, if it's just Florida, or we're just looking at the Florida coast where the hurricane's going to hit really bad, we only have a certain number of generators there. So price is going to rise, it's going to increase. Now that more people want to buy these generators in order to ration, what we have left. So the idea for price gouging laws or anti-price gouging laws is to prevent this from happening, to keep this lower price so people are able to afford generators. Obviously, this is a good impulse. We want people to have these things that are going to help them get through the storm. But it overlooks the fact that we're getting this increase in demand. Now, the price increases for any good or service, that's going to move us along the supply curve. So we have the demand increase out here. We move up the supply curve from this quantity to this quantity. Anyone have an idea how that happens in real life? What we see occurring, or how firms react? Factories make more. In the long run. In the short run, is that a possibility though? The storm's coming next week.
Send more to that area versus to other areas.
That's a big one. So Home Depot, they have locations, let's say, all over the South in this example. I don't know where Home Depot is located. I assume across the whole country. They don't need them in Georgia right now, or Alabama, Mississippi. So what they do, seeing that a storm's coming, the price is increasing, they ship them down there. Now it's gonna cost more money to ship them down there. You're adding a cost that you normally don't have associated with it. So they're not going to be willing to supply them at this equilibrium price. Again, because right here, the marginal benefit of this unit equals the marginal cost. If we're shipping from outside the area, we're increasing the marginal cost of actually selling. So we're moving up along the supply curve. By allowing the price to increase, we also increase the quantity that's being bought and sold. If we try to cap it at this previous equilibrium price, we're not going to sell any more units. Consumers are going to demand all those units out here. Well, let's say it's like 10,000. It rises to 15,000, so we're shipping in 5,000 more generators. We're able to because of the increased price that firms are getting. And then in this case, if we leave at the same price, people will want 20,000 units. As we saw with COVID when it first hit, if you keep prices at this previous low, when there's an increase in demand, you end up with empty shelves. So toilet paper is a big example. People suddenly thought they needed a 36-pack of toilet paper for just themselves for some reason. We didn't have people rationing like we would have because of the higher price. If you allow price to rise, that's one way to do it. Another way is just limiting how many people can buy. Saying, all right, the price is the same, but you can only walk away with one generator, which may be enough in this situation. Or for plywood, say you can only get so much plywood. But by masking the changes in supply and demand in this case, what we end up with is less of a product being there when it's being needed. All right, do you guys have any questions with this?